Okay. Well, great. So
Oh,
I'm.
sorry. Just actually, is the sound okay?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay,
It's
good.
working fine.
Okay,
Um,
sorry. I should have asked that before you started. Okay,
that's
sorry.
okay. Yeah, a fair question. So as you can hear, I'm joined by Tony Watkins, author and media specialist. He joins me from the UK today. So thanks for being here, Tony.
That's a great pleasure. Thank you, Wesley.
Awesome, great. So I found out about your work because of a book you wrote called Dark Matter, and it has a couple different subtitles. I was actually
Mm.
curious about that. It looks like it was printed first as the Thinking Fan's Guide and then reprinted as Shedding Light on Pullman's trilogy, his Dark Materials. Is there much difference between the two versions, or what's the story there?
The second version is the American version.
Oh,
So it was published in the UK with the subtitle, A Thinking Fan's Guide to Philip Pullman, because it was part of a series of books called A Thinking Fan's Guide. Um, so we did one on the Matrix trilogy. I think that was our first one. And then there was mine on Pullman, and we did one on Doctor Who as well. But in the US, the publisher there didn't have that series and felt that A Thinking Fan's Guide just didn't work for them. So Shedding Light was better for them. The only other difference is that the American version doesn't have an index, so you definitely need the English version.
yeah, it would be helpful. Yeah. Well, these days, you can search a text pretty
That's true.
easily. But yeah, an index is still definitely a handy tool. That so that's kind of, I guess, in some way, the book forms a matrix through which to read Philip Pullman. I found it
Yeah.
to be a really well done one of what I've read, the scholarship and kind of commentaries on Philip Pullman. I haven't read all of them by any stretch, but I really have enjoyed what I've read and yours in particular. So I was really glad when you responded when I reached out to do a little interview here. And particularly, I was curious about the interview that you had a chance to do with Philip Pullman as
Mm.
you were writing the book. That's available on your website, and it's really excellent. I encourage people to check it out. The transcript of it, that is up
Yes.
there, and it's extremely interesting. This could you just tell a little bit of the story behind that and kind of how it went and your thoughts on it since?
It was a funny experience altogether, really, because I met him at an event in Oxford and said, I'd like to interview you. Are you up for that? And he said, oh, absolutely, yes. And it was sometime later before we were able to arrange it. And I was having lunch with a friend in Oxford beforehand. Philip Pullman lives not far from Oxford in a village just to the west. And I came out from having lunch with my friend to discover that my mother-in-law's car, that I borrowed for the day, had a flat tire. So my friend gave me a lift over to Philip's house, which kind of created a little bit of stress for me to start with. So I arrived at his house with no means of escaping again afterwards, but and just didn't think until the end of the interview, which went on rather longer than anticipated. Um, at the end, I suddenly said, "Oh, I should have phoned for a taxi to pick me up when we had finished. I'm so sorry. Would you mind if I do one call for one now?" I didn't have a mobile phone at that point, and he said, "You will. It'll take you so long to get a taxi coming out from Oxford at this time to pick you up." He said, "I'll just give you a lift back to your mother-in-law's car." Um, so um, so Philip very kindly gave me a lift back into Oxford, which was just splendid. It was the moment driving down Sunderland Avenue, past the line of hornbeam trees, and thinking, "Okay, this is a weird moment. I'm driving down Sunderland Avenue with Philip Pullman." um,
That would be such a magical, I think, experience for anyone who's read the book,
oh,
particularly when you have actually met the author and you've had a chance to talk to him. I mean, what was it like talking to him and getting his take on things?
yeah, it was great. I'd anticipated being there for three-quarters of an hour or an hour, but as we went into his study, which is also at one end his workshop, so he has woodworking tools down there as well. He was only just beginning to move his woodworking things into there. No longer writing in a shed by this point. Um, which is a little disappointing. But he still has a shed window on his wall. He sold it to an artist or book illustrator friend of his, and so this artist took out one of the windows and gave it to him to hang on his wall. So anyway, he said, just remind me who you are and where you're from. So I explained, well, I'm a Christian. I'm
Right.
wanting to write about you from a particularly Christian perspective. Love your work, love what you've done, but I've got some, I'm coming at it from a very different angle. So explain those kinds of things. And he said, yes, I remember. Now, I have a few questions I'd like to ask you. And he spent 3/4 of an hour grilling me on all sorts of things. And then said, I'm so sorry, I'm hijacking this. You're supposed to be asking me the questions. So he then spent, I don't know, another 3/4 of an hour or so with me asking him questions. It was a splendid time. It was, he's immensely genial and obviously very intelligent. It was a very stimulating time. And I think he enjoyed it too. He gave me every impression that he was enjoying the conversation as much as I was. And some of it we continued in the car afterwards. But of course, I was neither writing notes nor recording at that point.
Right. Yeah. Which is, I think, another kind of interesting aspect of it. I guess there's always going to be so much surrounding the interview that can't be captured, that can't be
Yes.
kept in some sense. Yeah, I guess that's kind of where this kind of a book enters in, right? Like, because that same kind of penumbra surrounds any work of literature. There's all these sort of stories and things that don't make it into the final book, but that are there nonetheless, and that color it and impact it. And so then, someone comes along who's interested in the story, and then goes and seeks out some of those kinds of surrounding elements, right? The dark matter, right? And I find too that in many ways, some of the more interesting pieces about Pullman do come from people who are overtly Christian or religious in their outlook on things. Their kind of interests lie in that direction.
Yeah, that's a very interesting observation. I think that's right. I'm trying to think which of them I've read, because it's a while since I read any of them. Hugh Raymond Pickard had a particularly interesting take, I seem to remember. That was I didn't agree with a lot of what he wrote, but it was quite interesting. There were one or two others as well. I forget who they were now, but that is interesting. But he is raising such enormous questions, explicitly religious questions in many ways, with characters like Mary Malone and the whole kingdom of the Republic of Heaven and so on. So he's not exactly hiding that perspective of it.
Dent has written a book, the Good Man Jesus and the Scoundrel Christ. I guess that was probably on his mind as you guys were talking.
Well, I don't know. When I interviewed him in 2004, I think. That's 15 years ago now. That's extraordinary. I did drop him a line last year saying, can we do another interview at some point? But we haven't managed to arrange it yet. There's a lot more I want to ask him now. So, and the Good Man Jesus and the Scoundrel Christ came out in 2008, 2009, maybe some
years after, I suppose.
Yeah, a little bit later. Nevertheless, those ideas were very much in his mind. I actually find that the weakest of all of his books.
Yeah, I was a bit disappointed with it too.
For me, the problem is that obviously he has these very strong convictions about there is no elsewhere, there is no God, this is an entirely materialistic universe. Jesus was nothing more than a great moral teacher. He was a great moral teacher, but that's all he was. And he sees Jesus as having been overlaid with layers of invention by the early church, notably the Apostle Paul. So what he's trying to do in The Good Man Jesus and the Scoundrel Christ is to say, here is the authentic, the real Jesus, in a sense. I mean, he's not quite claiming that, but it's in the late Victorian era of liberal theology, there was the idea of the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith. And so you've got the Jesus of history, an ordinary guy, and yet all of this stuff is kind of coming on top to to create a very different story, and writing it in such a an old-fashioned biblical style. So I don't think it reads well. I think he's too. I think he's concentrating too much on telling his message rather than telling the story, and he criticizes people for that. He says that all storytellers teach whether the storyteller, all stories teach whether the storyteller intends them to or not. They teach the worlds we create. They teach the morality we live by. That's great. So stories teach whatever. But he says, I'm not trying to preach or write a philosophical treatise or whatever. I'm telling a story. And it felt to me that in The Good Man Jesus and The Scoundrel Christ, he was exactly doing that business of being philosophical and preaching or whatever. So, I'm disappointed by that one.
Yeah, and I think, it's a bit disingenuous when he says those things, because he does clearly have a very strong opinion about a lot of this stuff. He's obviously very interested in it and very knowledgeable about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I mean, that comes through in his conversations a great deal, and then also, in its own way through his writing. People talk about how that's, becomes more prevalent in the Amber Spyglass as well. Of the three books of the original trilogy, people tend to say that the third is their least favorite for that very reason. I don't know if that was experience.
I think that's right. I had really conflicted feelings reading the Amber Spyglass. I had absolutely loved Northern Lights, or The Golden Compass, as you call it, over your side of the pond, and The Subtle Knife. Just stunning works of fiction. And the Amber Spyglass was too. But there were moments where I felt that he was letting the ideas get the better of him. Mary Malone, for instance, says some very strong things. And he says that it's natural that he should have a character that speaks for him in some sense. He said, why should I have all of my characters who speak against me? Which is absolutely reasonable. And that's fine. But I think he kind of blurs the boundaries a little bit when he has a character that says very strong things, a character from our world saying very strong things in his fiction about the church in our world, that lines up precisely with the kinds of strong things that he says about the church and about religion in our world. And so she is absolutely his mouthpiece at that point. And so I think what happens is that he then, I just think there are a few times where he loses sight of the story itself and is too caught up with trying to say the ideas. And it would be better if he just had a little more restraint at that point and allowed the story to push on. Hint at those things, show us those things. Don't labor the point. And I think he just got a bit preachy at times, and that's one of the few weaknesses of the trilogy, I think, which I still think is a stunning piece of work.
Yeah, well, I agree. Like I've always loved all of the books of them. Each has, things that I particularly love, and maybe a few things that are, I think, work less well or whatever. But, for me, I read them as a kid and I was not a critical eye, as I was reading the third book. I just devoured it when it finally came out. It was like years later, right? So I was waiting and waiting. And it's only in hindsight I have any kind of, analytic distance to see any of these effects. But I think it's also telling that it's the largest of the three. It's baggiest in other respects too. He's telling more of the story, which he always talks about having to try to restrain himself from and stick to the path, as he talks about in that one essay, the story that is the path through the wood of the wood of all this other woolly kind of material that he's taken from and sort of alludes to. And now, since then, he's written a couple short books, Liars Oxford and Once Upon a Time in the North. And so he's exploring those other areas. He's written this short audio piece, The Collectors, right, about Mrs. Coulter and this painting of her golden monkey demon, which is creepy and cool. And he's written also, of course, La Belle Sauvage, and now the Secret
Yeah,
Commonwealth coming out soon. Have you read
yeah,
some of this later stuff of his, and what do you make of how he's developed since the Amber Spyglass?
yeah. I just love going back to the world.
Yeah,
So I really enjoyed those two little books. They were just so beautifully produced as well. Um, Especially Lyra's Oxford with the postcards and things in there. Just uh, yeah, there was something absolutely delightful about the way that David Fickling put those together, the printing of them and everything. Just beautiful books in every sense. La Belle Sauvage, I thought, was fabulous. Completely not what I was expecting. When I interviewed him, he said that he was working on the Book of Dust, and this was going to be his creation myth for the whole thing.
yeah,
So that's what I've been holding my breath for. And then along comes this book, and it's not the creation myth. It's this brilliant narrative about Lyra as Lyra's beginnings, really. And so, oh, great. But this is not what I was expecting. So what's going to happen in the Secret Commonwealth? It sounds like it's more narrative. It doesn't sound like it's giving us the creation myth. But maybe that's going to leak in some ways. Or maybe he's just changed his mind about what the Book of Dust is going to be. It took him long enough to start working on it, because 2004, he said, I'll be doing it soon.
right, right.
And then I kept dropping him emails saying, how's the Book of Dust doing? He said, well, I'm doing too much publicity, or I'm working on another book and I haven't quite got to it yet. Or, it's been a long wait. And then,
Yeah,
but great works.
yeah, and it is so. La Belle Sauvage, it's sort of set before the other material.
Mm.
It it picks up some threads like we hear. I think at some point from the Egyptians, we hear about Lord Asriel saving some of their kids in a flood,
Mm.
right?
Yes.
It's like mentioned, and that's a historical thing, right?
Yes.
In Oxford, there was a big flood in the mid-century, right?
Joy. Yeah.
So it kind of takes that, but the timing isn't quite right. Like it's got to be closer to the 80s, at least in our world, because that's when Will is born. And from his letters, we learned that from his dad's letters, we learned that, right? This is one of the big questions I've had as I've been rereading these books is getting straight the chronology of events. Just like
Right.
when is everything happening in relation to other things? Because sometimes it seems like, especially Mrs. Coulter, just like zips from one place to another, like so quickly. And then it's mentioned that Lord Asriel must have been planning this rebellion for eons because he's got this huge castle that he's somehow right. It's like time doesn't seem to flow quite, and so I wonder if that's part of this like fairy element that Pullman has brought in explicitly now
Right.
to kind of get around that problem. If there's fairy powers, in a fairyland, in one of these multiple universes or in the background of all of them, maybe then maybe you can sort of mess around with time and I know that's part of the physics that he's interested in too, right? Because if you're dealing with cutting through space and multiple universes, then you've also got to account for problems with timelines, and if there's other worlds, then are there other yous in those worlds having their
Yes.
different? So this is something I guess you've also studied a bit of physics, and maybe have you thought a bit about some of the problems with time and how Pullman has accounted for that or could account for that?
I think that's a really good observation about the time things, and it's not something I'd reflected on in relation to La Belle Sauvage, and I really ought to have done, because what you say about Lord Asriel planning this huge rebellion for so long is absolutely, it's a very good point. There's no sign of him doing that in La Belle Sauvage, but of course if he has some means of getting through to another world, then yes, he could do his preparations there, maybe. I think the timing of the flood isn't an issue because that's in. There's no need necessarily for time in Will's world to be running in parallel with time in Lyra's world, so I'm not too worried about that one. Yeah, so that's a very interesting. I'm going to have to go away and think about that.
Well,
Yeah,
please
good
do.
question.
Yeah, I've talked to, well, I haven't spoken to her, but I've exchanged emails with Laurie Frost, who's also written a big companion volume to the
Uh-huh.
trilogy, and she does a lot of, glossing and indexing things out. And
Mm.
asked her about the chronology question too, because that's one of the things that isn't in her book. She's got great
Right.
maps of like their path through Oxford and things like this, but I didn't see like a, here's when each event happens in relation to the other events, and here's
Mm.
how long the story takes to from the point where Lyra hides in the retiring room to the point where they go their separate ways at the end. Like, what is exact? Where are we in terms of a year? Where are we in terms of, I just am very curious about seasons, like when things.
Yes.
But in his discussion with you, he does talk about his origin story, his myth that he's been
Mm.
working on and tinkering with,
Yes.
and he reads some of it, which I thought was so
Yes.
interesting. He talks about the original rebellion of angels being the point at which all the worlds sort of fragment from each other, and he just kind of tosses that off as like a little aside, like, I like this
Yes.
little idea. I don't know if it matters, but it's that, and I think that's a key that to note that he really likes that idea. Probably it strikes me as a way to say that humbly, right? But but I think that's so interesting that in some way their rebellion would cause this fragmenting of time and space and
Mm.
lead to all these different then reconnections much later as people pass from world to world. It seems to be the prerogative of the angels to do that. They seem to know how to do that. Um, but then later, of course, it becomes a kind of tragic thing when the creators of the knife, right, don't really understand what they're doing, and they,
Mm.
unleash the specters. And when Lord Asriel, creates this huge rent in the fabric of his world, it leads to the climate changing and these
Yep.
disasters. So there's like this kind of unintended consequence in both cases. In the former case, leading to the fragmenting of worlds and all these possible stories
Mm.
that
Mm.
unfold, right? And in the latter case, this kind of disastrous element of passing between worlds, and of course, finally, we have to go back to our own worlds. I find that to be a really intricate and complex thing. Pullman talks about the knife being something he didn't really understand as he was writing it. Like
Yes.
he knew there
Yes.
was more
That's
to it.
right.
And I feel like that's the way probably his story is as a whole, right? It must have different effects on people than he can imagine. Um,
Mm.
I know that's been true for us, I guess, and maybe for lots of readers who, read these books and far from, doubting their faith, actually think more deeply about it and
Mhm.
have a greater kind of appreciation of it. That's been my experience anyhow. And maybe you could just, I don't know, that's a lot of different stuff, I know, but maybe just
Mm.
speak to that kind of unintended consequence,
Yeah.
possibility, that realm
Yeah.
of his physics.
Yeah. He talks about unintended consequences of the knife, as you say, in the interview with me. I think he quotes Yorick Bernison saying, "This knife has intentions of which its makers weren't aware," or something along those lines. And he says it's a metaphor for our creation of technology that always has consequences that we don't necessarily anticipate. And it's not until later on that we can look back and say, well, there were some good things, but there were some things that we really um, didn't never thought were going to come out of that. And I think there's quite a bit of that. Um, the knife, one or two other things functioning as metaphors of
Yeah.
the way that we make decisions at the time, that we may not care about the consequences, or we may not be able to anticipate the consequences. And of course, there's a difference between those two things. And I think maybe that ties into his own storytelling, that he's telling his story in the moment, and perhaps doesn't necessarily always anticipate the consequences of the turns that he that he puts in himself. Hence, he ends up with a chronology that might be a little bit difficult to tie up at the end of all of this. um, yeah, maybe his own subtle knife has intentions of which he's not aware.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, sort of like the rational intellect, trying to chop things into neat little. That's kind of
yes,
one other way I think about the knife, right? It's like, of course, it doesn't act rationally at all within his world. It does impossible things, and that's
yes,
kind of the key to it. But it also, classically as an image, as if it were on the alethiometer, one of the top meanings would be rational intellect. I think, it's like chopping up things and dicing them up in neat little ways.
yes.
And I think he mentions that Will would later become a surgeon. I don't know if he's stuck with that idea and maybe we'll find out. But
Mm.
it can be a thing where you use that ability to heal and to bind up wounds, right? Not
Mm.
only to cut things apart, but then to see what they are at bottom, and then be able to better understand how to heal them, how to put them back together. I
Yes,
absolutely think that that's one of the outcomes of his analysis of religion, of myth, as he's sort of cutting into it and wounding it in some ways. He's also providing certain tools with which to maybe rebuild it, reconstruct it.
sure.
um, I,
The
I don't
idea of
know.
moral responsibility is huge
Yeah,
for him. That we have to act in a way that is um, for the good of others, because we are connected with them, and so the whole idea of connectedness is the connectedness of everything is central to his idea of the Republic of Heaven. So that the king is dead, there is no, there is no king, there is no God, but the ideas of heaven are nevertheless important to us, he says, and so we need to, because there's no elsewhere, we need to create heaven where we are in this world, and so he says it's a way of expressing our connectedness, our mutual interdependence, and therefore also our sense of responsibility. And the trilogy and his other books, there's a very strong moral thread going through them. He's far from being a postmodern relativist who says that everybody's morality is down to their personal choice. He thinks that there are some things that are right and some things that are wrong, and therefore we should be using our freedom and our responsibility and our wisdom, which of course he thinks is entirely um, derived from us beginning to exercise freedom and then discovering what happens as a consequence of that. So it's something that we accumulate through the exercise of our freedom. So we have to use those attributes for the good of others ultimately, and so I think that's one of the reasons why the trilogy has been so inspiring for people, I think, because Lyra and Will and the other heroes of the story, they do act in a very selfless way, um, even to their own cost sometimes, and that's hugely commendable. Um, I can't remember whether it was in the interview or not. I said to him, um, "Some of these values, they're rather Christian values," and he said, "Why do you bloody Christians always think you have you have the right to values? These are just human values."
yeah, yeah. Fair, okay. But I think that their expression is crystallized in a particular way in different
Yes,
particular stories. And
yes,
obviously the Christian one has had a huge impact on him personally, and on the culture that he's brought up in, and that he's
yes,
in a deep way passing it on in this new
yes,
form, albeit,
yes.
but totally recapitulating the story of the fall. Like, that's
Mm,
explicitly his
mm,
theme. And
mm,
and it's inevitable that if you care about his story, you're going to want to read his sources, right? You're going to go to Milton and Blake and the Bible, and you're going to read the
yes.
King James Version. And that's like, I wouldn't have been so gung-ho about like reading the Bible if I hadn't first read Philip Pullman. So
Oh,
it's a very,
that's a fascinating
yeah.
observation.
Uh,
Yeah.
so I guess
Interest, sorry, I was just going to say, interestingly, he doesn't cite, when I said what are your big influences, or in writing. No, maybe it wasn't in the interview. Maybe in other places he talks about his three big influences being, as you say, Milton and Blake, and then um, Kleist's essay on the marionette theatre. He doesn't list the Bible as part of that, and yet the Bible clearly is a massive, massive influence on him. When you ask him what, or when he talks about his worldview, he says, "I'm a." Sometimes he says he's an agnostic. Sometimes he says he's an atheist. But he often specifies that to say, "I'm an atheist. I'm a very particular kind of atheist. I'm a Christian atheist, and more to the point, I'm a Church of England atheist, because that's the kind of God that I'm rejecting." And that's the world that he grew up in. His grandfather was a Church of England vicar, chaplain of Norwich Prison. His father had died at the age of 7, so he and his mother lived with his grandparents for a while. His grandfather was a massively influential figure on him. And yet, as a teen, he turned away from his grandfather's faith. I don't know what kind of Christian his grandfather was. He describes him as being a very Victorian kind of Christian, I think. I can't remember quite what he thinks he means by that, but it could mean that he was. I think he means he's probably just a very traditional sort of Church of England vicar, but clearly massively influential on him. So yeah, it shaped his thinking in profound ways.
Well, yeah, and he tells stories about um, feeling the power of words, through poetry, and I think inevitably, again, of the power of um, the language of I don't know, being in church, or maybe hearing his grandfather tell some of these stories.
Mm.
I imagine that must have been a very formative thing. Um, he he talks a bit about losing his father, how that is similar to other great writers like Tolkien, whose father died young. Right,
Mm.
he makes that connection, which I think is pretty telling. Um,
Mm.
you bring up in your book, I thought one of the really good points that you made was about how actually losing his mother might have been formative as well, although much later, right?
Mm.
How the time, I guess, going back to timing again, but as he's writing The Golden Compass, it's in the early 90s. That would have been around the death of his mother. And
Mm.
so that becomes a theme in the story, actually, is this idea of Will having to go away from his mother, right, in the
Mm.
second book.
Yeah.
And he's always thinking of her. He's always worrying about her. And it becomes kind of a crisis, actually, because it's the thing that shatters the knife, right? When he's thinking of his mother rather than thinking about what he has to do. I wonder how that, going back to like the knife as a metaphor for Pullman's book, is that part of what makes writing that so difficult for him, and it takes him such a long time to kind of get
Mm.
the final book to come together, that he's still working through some of his personal, feelings for his parents, his mother who just died, his
Mm.
father who he knew very little.
Yes, that's a very interesting idea. You may well be right. I just, I don't know. I can't really comment on that.
That's fine. No, it's
He
your
says
idea
his,
that made me think of it. So
yeah, that's very interesting. He says that his father, loss of his father when he was 7, didn't have a big impact on him,
yeah,
and he flatly denies that has anything to do with his rejection of God.
right.
Um, uh, and yet, I I can't quite escape from the feeling that he protests too much over this. Um, in that, now obviously I cannot presume to say what's going on inside his head. If that's, if he says it didn't have a big impact on him because his father was a glamorous but remote figure who he hardly knew. He was a pilot in the Royal Air Force, was killed in a plane crash, um, with eventually it turned out questionable circumstances about that his father may have been drinking beforehand, and
Mm.
yeah, so all of that anyway, that came out much later. So but he says that because of his father being remote and he didn't see that much of him, he says I probably wept at the time but didn't do much to him. And yet for a 7-year-old boy with a glamorous heroic father who he's never going to see again, and then grows up in a situation where he has not really known his father and never will know his father, seems to me that is going straight into Will, who is
Yeah.
desperate to find his father. And I can't quite escape from the feeling that sense of being cheated out of that relationship feeds into his rejection of the idea of God. As I say, he denies it. I I just wonder. We don't always know ourselves what goes on in our minds, do we? We have ways of as I do myself. Absolutely, every one of us has ways of rationalizing the things that have happened to us, of constructing narratives for our lives that um, that are a way of making sense of who we are and where we are in the world and the kind of people that we are. And those narratives are not always um, not always a proper reflection of what happened at the time. We have ways of twisting things. I mean, you see it in particularly, most graphically, probably in cases of people who have been abused as children, and they have find ways of kind of blotting that out of their memory until something happens to trigger it, and then suddenly all of this pain and horror comes back. And for those of us who've not had that kind of experience, that seems, well, how could you not? And yet it's so well documented. So we have ways of constructing protecting narratives for ourselves. So it's something I wonder, but I don't know. It'll keep denying it.
Can only speculate, and I think you're right to caution against inferring something that is, of course, deeply personal for him, any more than him saying, no, you don't believe in God. It's like those are sort of equivalent claims, and I think in your interview, you touch on that, how you can't ever really speak for someone else, but one's own conscience is sort of supreme and sovereign. But I think about this too in terms of his writing of this story is so powerful. It must sort of weave in, at least subconsciously or archetypally or something like this, some of that emotion that comes out of his experience. I think it has to. And one really interesting aspect of this, I think there's a few places where this comes through, but one is at the end of The Subtle Knife, when Will is wrestling in the dark with the figure who proves to be his father. That wrestling in the night strikes me as being awfully similar to a story like Jacob and the Angel, right? There has to be some kind of resonance there, and I think maybe it has to be grounded in this kind of human experience of, wondering, wrestling with, figuratively, one's place in the world, one's place in the family, whatever. I think that those things do kind of connect pretty. I don't know about. I'm sure you've studied that passage in the Bible a bit more, and could you say a little bit about how, what's going on there in the soul? It's a very mysterious moment, because why are they wrestling? Like, why? What's going on? Yeah.
Oh, it is a very mysterious moment where Jacob finds himself wrestling with this figure who blesses him in the, they struggle all night, they fight all night, and then this figure blesses him in the morning by dislocating his hip, and Jacob is never the same again. And it seems, and he says, "This is the place where I've seen God, where I've struggled with God." And so he understands that this figure that he can't overpower is God in some human form. Some people suggest that it's an angel, which is, I mean, in terms of the Hebrew, I believe that's entirely reasonable. Or it could be some people suggest it's a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus.
Whoa.
But that, maybe, I don't know. I'm not in a position to be able to speculate too much on that. I think I tend to go with the idea that it's most likely the angel of the Lord who is fighting with Jacob, and is obviously God's representative at that point, because that's what the angels are. But Jacob bears the mark of that through the rest of his life. Then he always has that limp, reminding him of this encounter with God, and he was never the same again. He had been a deceiver and a cheater, and didn't like it when he got cheated. Not the nicest of guys for a very long time, and yet from that point on, everything was different, and he was reunited with reconciled with his brother who he cheated, and it becomes one of the one of the patriarchs of the nation of Israel. Um,
Well,
and then
that name Israel, isn't that also a relic of this meeting, right? The one who wrestles
indeed,
with God or something.
absolutely,
Yeah.
yes, it is. Yeah. So there it is, preserved right down through the history of all of his descendants. So it's a hugely important moment, and yet utterly mysterious. Um, I don't know that Philip Pullman is trying to deliberately evoke that, but have that there's a resonance there, absolutely, as you say. So many of the biblical stories, again, because of his background, so many of the biblical stories kind of are just hovering,
Yeah.
hovering deep in the background. There's something I think that was probably intriguing and mysterious to him about that encounter between Jacob and the angel or God himself, and that pops up in an unexpected way. I suspect that if you said to him, "Is there something going on here?" he'd say, "Oh, I've never spotted it," but
Yeah.
maybe not. Maybe he does. Maybe he would be aware.
Well, again, I mean, even back to Plato, he talks about, poets are inspired. They don't really know why they write the things they do or say,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And he talks about this too as this
Yes, he
voice, this
does.
narrative voice. It feels like from outside of him. It speaks to him,
Mm,
and he just channels it when he's writing. His
mm.
characters sort of carry the story, um, and I guess if you've ever written fiction and stuff, you probably have experienced that too, or poetry, where you get this kind of inspiration, but he also talks about how hard he works. He really
Yes.
stresses, right? You have to be disciplined. You have to make yourself do it because it's hard work, right? And so there is this other element of it where he's very much in control. He speaks of himself as the authority of the story, which is a loaded word in his world.
Yes, it is.
Yeah,
Yes, the authority of the story, and yet he says that he has no authority over the story, having written it. That
exactly.
he
Once it's
can't
out there.
say this is what it means. It's for he talks about the democracy of reading is it the phrase he uses? I think it is, isn't it? So that we the readers have to figure out what it means for ourselves. And he says that the text makes certain readings more plausible or more difficult, but that he can't say this is what he means. There's strong echoes of Umberto Eco at this point in his stuff about interpreting literature, because Eco had strongly adopted reader response
Mm.
theory that it is all down to the reader. And then as time went on, he said, no, that's not enough because the author did mean something. And the text preserves stuff within it that makes certain readings possible and makes certain readings impossible. And yet I do come at it and read it as who I am, not as who somebody else is. And I read it as who I am today, not as who I am tomorrow. Um, and the author was clearly trying to communicate something, and yet what it was that the author was trying to communicate is actually now inaccessible even to the author because they're not the same person they were when they wrote it. So he says that the meaning of a text is in the locus of meaning is within the interplay of those three things of author and text and reader. But ultimately, he says the text has I can't remember the phrase he uses, but it has a controlling influence over that dynamic because it is a fixed thing,
Yeah.
and therefore does rule in some things and rule out other things. So there is that tension in Pullman saying, yes, I'm the authority because I create the story. I'm not the authority because it's over to you.
Yeah.
Um, uh, and I think he's sometimes a little disingenuous about not saying this is what I meant.
Yeah.
I understand why he doesn't want to say this is what it means, but I think sometimes he could say a little more about this is what I meant, this is what I was thinking when I wrote it. But I suppose as soon as he does that, then he makes that an authoritative reading,
Right.
and he's not prepared to do that.
Yeah. Well, I would be really curious, if there were questions that you could ask him about parts of his writing, what was going on or what he was drawing on for certain things. It sounded like you had some questions like that prepared in your interview, but you never got a chance to ask them. So
Yes.
what places in the writing or what things about his writing process would you have wanted to get to ask him, or would you ask him if you got to talk again, and then you didn't get sidetracked into Jesus and all this stuff?
Yeah, probably deep in the darkest recesses of my computer, I still have a file with all the questions I intended to ask him, but I don't suppose I've looked at that since 2004. I think it's probably still there somewhere. Um, I'd love to have asked him more, so many things that I wanted to ask him at the time. What would I want to ask him now? Um, I think I would want, yeah, I would probably want to ask him about that kind of thing we were just talking about. I think in some ways of how he sees that interplay of author and text and reader, because we touched on it in our interview, but didn't go very much further with it. Um, I, and I think he said such interesting things in other contexts, particularly when speaking about children's literature in general, about the nature of literature and the process of writing. So I have all sorts of questions about his actual process of creating stories. I'd love to talk to him more about what he sees as some of the deepest motivations for characters like Azrael. I mean, we see what they do, but what was it that got Azrael going in the first place? I think that the conversation I had with him about the creation myth, and he gave me a copy of it, which on the condition that I never tell anybody, I never publish it, and I never tell anybody what its contents are, other than what he has already said publicly. So I have it, and it's fascinating. I would love to, because I hadn't read that at the time. I'd love to go back to him now and say, okay, how much of this do you still go along with? And in particular, I mean, the one thing he said a little bit about publicly about Sophia as the personification of wisdom. So there's a character of Sophia. I think she comes up in the interview. The little bit he reads to me. Does he mention Sophia in there? I don't know. Yeah. But so I'd love to talk to him about how Sophia is then how that bringer of wisdom in Sophia then appears within the role of the tempter, and how she has shaped characters, and what she's done to various characters or various other incarnations, if that's for want of a better word for Sophia, how various characters have reached their moment of wisdom. We see it for Will and Lyra because they're the central pieces in his big chessboard of what's going on. But I want to know more about what drives some of these other secondary characters, and particularly the ones who are seen to be heroic and flawed, perhaps, but still heroic. The Egyptians, what's driving the Egyptians? What, so many questions.
They seem to be, connected to the land in this deep way. In the new book, right, in the Belle Sauvage,
yes,
they know what's going on. They know it's going to flood before it happens, and and the government doesn't. They're incompetent.
Yeah. And that's got to tie into the whole world of fairy thing that he introduced. That was a fascinating thing that suddenly I did not expect the world of fairy to be coming through. And out there, he's in the same territory as Lewis again, isn't he? He has been described as the anti-C.S. Lewis. He's very dismissive of C.S. Lewis, but writes in the same territory.
Yeah, yeah,
And even more so now, he's explicitly bringing in fairy characters. Tolkien too,
yeah,
who talks about the importance of um, the world of fairy in his essay on fairy stories,
right,
uh, and how the world of fairy and the stories that we tell are a reflection, an echo, a recapitulation of the what he and Lewis and I see as the fundamental story of the universe, which is
right.
God rescuing us, God creating and then rescuing us through actually coming into the world as Jesus in the incarnation and his death and resurrection, and so Tolkien has this idea of the eucatastrophe, the disaster that leads to the good,
Yeah,
which is seen particularly uh, in the cross and resurrection of Jesus. But he says that the happy ending of the fairy tale is that echo of that's deep, written deep into the human heart, and we can't get away from it. And if Tolkien were around today, he would say, "Yeah, Pullman is doing that too."
yeah,
He has the catastrophe too. He can't get away with it. Can't get away from it. There is still that longing for the happy ending. Now, Pullman would say there's a completely different explanation for why we want the happy ending, and it's nothing to do with Tolkien's explanation. And he would say, well, yes, I'm writing in the same kind of territory as Lewis, but that's because fairy tales are fun.
right.
And Pullman did a great version of the Brothers Grimm fairy tales, or some of them anyway. Splendid reading of those, really fresh and dynamic. So he's a great fan of fairy tales. So some of the influences on Lewis and on Tolkien are some of the influences on Pullman too. So it's no surprise that he's writing in the same territory and yet doing such very different things with them.
Yeah. So I was curious. I wanted to ask you if you've read much of Barfield as the other inkling of
Uh,
his whole consciousness thing. Like, what do you make of him and how Pullman might fit in with some of his territory on language, on you know uh, anthroposophy, or whatever
yeah.
term he wants to use.
I have to confess, I have just tinkered around the very edge of Barfield, as it were. I've read very little by
Okay.
him, one or two essays, and read some things about him. But yeah, I think I better not go there. I'll excuse my ignorance too disastrously.
Okay, no, that's fine. I also would not profess to understand a lot of the Barfield I've read, and so I'm always trying to get people's help with it. So,
Yeah,
uh,
look somewhere else.
yeah. Well, cool. Well, thank you again, Tony. As far as your current work, I know you said you're going to a conference in Poland pretty soon.
I am.
What kinds of stuff are you currently really interested in going on in pop culture, media, new literature, and stuff? And what are you working on and doing in Poland?
The conference I'm at in Poland is the European Leadership Forum. So it's 1,000 Christian leaders from across Europe, from 20 odd different nations. So I'll be teaching a couple of sessions, workshops on one on some of the which ties in with Pullman, is in the stories that we tell, there are a number of key themes that we keep going back to again and again and again, that I, as a Christian, maintain these are reflections of the biblical storyline, because I'm influenced by Tolkien, I suppose, and what we were saying just now, that the story of what God has done and is doing in the world is somehow written into our subconscious in ways that I don't understand. I don't know whether Tolkien understood. I suspect not. He just said, it's there. So things like the Paradise Lost story, the fact that we had a wonderful world and we've turned our back on it. We've lost it in some sense. So you could find that in a story as simple as Mrs. Doubtfire. It's the kids have a happy life with their dad, but their dad's a bit of a mess, and he ends up being chucked out of the house, and he can't see his kids anymore. And he didn't realize what a good world he had until now he can't have it, and so he has to become Mrs. Doubtfire in order to be able to see his kids again. I don't know why that example occurred to me, but but there we are. So it pops up in all sorts of places. So the Paradise Lost story, which obviously comes up in His Dark Materials. Then there's the idea of breaking free, which again, His Dark Materials, because what human beings were doing in the first temptation at the fall in the Garden of Eden is to rebel against God's authority. Pullman sees that as the moment at which we discover wisdom for ourselves, because we exert our independence of God. Yeah, we did exert our independence from God, but that was the moment at which we surrendered the wisdom that we did have to a large extent. We were given all the wisdom that we needed. So we're breaking free of God's authority. And we keep recapitulating that in that we break free of all sorts of things. So Truman, at the end of the Truman Show, is breaking free from Christoph's authority as he steps through the door and says, in case I don't see you, good afternoon, good evening, good night. So he's breaking free. And then there's the ideas of things like remaking the world, because once we're east of Eden, once we're exiled from living in relationship with God, we have to remake the world in some sense. The Republic of Heaven is what's going on. There's an attempt to refashion the world in a way that doesn't include God within it. Then there's defeating the monsters, because we are surrounded by enemies. Some of them are internal enemies, some of them are physical enemies, some of them are enemies from the environment. But life becomes a struggle, and we have to kill the dragons or whatever. What else have we got? Finding true love. Not necessarily romantic love, but finding his father. He wants the genuine love of the father to his son, as well as the love that Will and Lyra eventually find. I've got 7. Coming home at the end. We long to be back home. Or to find home in the first place. And I've missed one out. Overcoming brokenness. So it's closely connected with the remaking the world, but we become so aware of our brokenness in the world. I think it was Matt Zoller Seitz who took over from Roger Ebert as the film critic for RogerEbert.com. I think it's him in an essay he wrote on Wes Anderson. He said that Wes Anderson's work is all about dealing with brokenness. And that's we become aware of brokenness as we go into adolescence, and that's what defines us. Very interesting. So the whole business of overcoming the brokenness within us and around us is huge. So one of the things I'm doing is talking about those big themes. Finding enlightenment maybe is another one, though I haven't got that in my outline. And then what's my other one on worldviews? Something on worldviews. So that's what's coming up next week. And more generally, I'm working on a doctorate at the moment, looking at the relationship between the Old Testament prophets and contemporary media.
Interesting.
Early days for that, relatively speaking. And I'm at a point where I need to make some big decisions about which direction I'm going in. So, yeah, I'm enjoying that immensely.
Cool. That's a really interesting project. I would really like to learn more, I guess, to talk to you again at some time. I'm, just starting the Subtle Knife here, so I'm going to be reading these books for a while yet. More are still coming out, and I've really enjoyed getting this chance to talk to you. I hope to see you again.
Great pleasure. Thank you very much for having me on, Wesley.
Awesome. Great. All right.